Hello. This is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, well, I'm here, as the title suggests, to talk off the stories of films. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, well, they're movies I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. That I try not to do snark, I try not to punch down. I'm here to celebrate cinema, the fact that films get made. It's really difficult to make them, and I really want to applaud the fact that they end up on our screens. Now, for this particular episode, I'm going to be talking about one of my all-time favourite movies. I'm going to kick off with that one. So let's get straight into it. I'm going to take you back to 1999. I'm going to play you a clip, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Two nights ago, a SATCOM radar detected an unidentified object entering Earth's atmosphere.
Invaders from Mars.
Some assumed it was a large meteor or a downed satellite. This is no meteor, gentlemen. This is something much more dangerous.
So, I guess you're not gonna hurt me, huh? This is unbelievable.
That was a clip from 1999's absolutely wonderful animated movie, The Iron Giant, directed by Brad Bird, penned by Tim McCanlies and Brad Bird, based on The Iron Man by Ted Hughes, and with a voice cast including the likes of Jennifer Aniston, Harry Connick Jr., Vin Diesel, Cloris Leachman, John Mahoney, and Emmett Walsh. So let's start this story with Brad Bird himself, the co-writer and director of the movie, who'd been bumbling around film and TV really from the 1980s. He'd done his work at Disney. He'd really spiked with some work with Steven Spielberg on the TV show Amazing Stories, in particular the episode Family Dog. He'd gone on to do work with The Simpsons. There's one film he did I'm particularly fond of as well in this era that he wrote, the screenplay to Batteries Not Included. A really terrific film that is, which I'm going to come to at some point, directed by Matthew Robbins, with whom he tried to get a few other things going. But the films he was working on at Disney, well, they weren't during Disney's peak era, let's just say that. I mean, The Black Cauldron I will come to in a future episode, because what a fascinating story. But things like The Fox and the Hound as well. And so Bird had been trying to get films going, and he'd ended up at a company called Turner Entertainment, in particular zeroing in on a project called Ray Gunn. Now, Ray Gunn was to be the last human detective hired for a very special case, although a slightly adult, not that fruity, leaning case. And he got quite far down the road with this. I mean, concept art was being drawn up for the movie, work was underway. At the same time, Bird was directing episodes of shows like, well, The Simpsons is the standout really, but also, though, he was working on shows around this time like Family Dog and The Critic and King of the Hill. And he was bubbling up. People knew who Brad Bird was within the animation community, but he hadn't been able to land a feature. So let's then take the story back to 1968 and that of Welsh poet Ted Hughes, who published the story that year, The Iron Man. Now, The Iron Man was about a giant metal man who befriends a small boy and, in this case, defends the world from the threat of an extraterrestrial dragon. And this was a book of interest. I mean, it was successful and it got the attention of The Who's Pete Townsend, who turned it into, he used it as influence for an album and then a stage musical as well. And the stage musical debuted, 92, 93. And so there was always the nagging feeling there that there might be a film in this as well. Not least because animation in the early 1990s was being dominated by Disney animated musicals. This was the second golden age, really. The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and then in particular The Lion King, which went absolutely nuts at the box office. And so every studio was scrambling to get into the animation business and to try and catch up with what Disney was doing. Warner Brothers was no exception to this, and it picked up the screen rights to the Iron Man with a view of taking the stage show and turning it into an animated musical. Meanwhile, over at Turner Entertainment, Bird was still battling away trying to get a green light for Ray Gunn. And the Turner executives, well, they just weren't really biting. That there wasn't anyone outright saying no, but as Bird has often said, there was a lot of middle management who really weren't doing an awful lot to help push the film forward, and he was growing frustrated with it all. But Warner Brothers too was transitioning at this point, and in the mid-1990s it acquired Turner Entertainment and started merging it into its film and TV division. And so there was a fresh chance to get Ray Gunn off the ground, put it in front of Warner Brothers executives, and they weren't convinced either. I mean, the film was skewing a little bit older than where they were looking to position their animated films. Again, it wanted what Disney had. That wasn't teenagers, that wasn't adult viewers, that was families, the core family audience of all ages, and that's what it was targeting. So Ray Gunn wasn't happening, but Warner Brothers still had the Iron Man on its books, and Bird's credits were growing. There was still that interest in getting him to do a film. And so he was invited into the Warner Brothers animation studio to discuss potentially taking a different project on, and he was given a tour of the slate of things that they had, the bits and bobs they were working on. And that's where he saw the artwork of a young boy and a giant robot and learned that Warner Brothers was considering making a musical version of the Iron Man. So when Ray Gunn finally got the can, Bird was then invited to pitch for other projects. And he had this idea in his head of how he could bring the Iron Man to the screen. It would be a different version of the story. It would relocate its setting. It would add in new characters. He would set the film in the 1950s against the backdrop of the paranoia of the Cold War and the atom bomb. But at the heart, he wanted to zero in on a story of a young boy and a huge robot. And as he would describe, he said, my version is based around a question. I asked the executives at Warner Brothers, what if a gun had a soul and chose not to be a gun? And he said, I wanted to honour the book, but also take it in a new direction. So Warner Brothers was interested and gave him the nod to develop the film a little. And so Bird brought in Tim McCanlies to work with him on a screenplay. McCanlies had worked on films such as Secondhand Lions at that point. They quickly got rid of the music. They quickly established that this is not going to be a musical at all. And they got to work on a script. So then things were moving quickly. The script led to storyboards, and in came Alison Abate to join as a producer on the movie. Now, I've interviewed her a couple of times, a terrific animation producer. In the early stages of her career here, she'd just come off the back of Space Jam, which was a Warner Brothers production. But with her on the crew, they were getting things moving ahead at speed. The storyboards were coming together, the script was coming together, the development art was coming together. All these things were having to happen concurrently because of the opportunity really and the acceleration required of the project. And they got the nod off Warner Brothers in the end that the film could go ahead at the end of August 1996. Now, Brad Bird then inked his deal to make his directorial debut at last at the end of that year. But as Alison Abate remembered, we hammered at it, and by August we had about 30 minutes of the film storyboarded. We were given the green light to go into production. As Bird would tell in an interview with Animation World published sometime after the release of the eventual film, finally getting the chance to direct a feature film after so many years of trying was completely exhilarating. He said, I've been in the business for quite a while at that point. Many of my prior experiences in movies have been negative, meaning I'd worked on several films with bad leadership, so an important part of my education was in learning what not to do. A further important part of his education was coming from the world of television, where the deadlines were a lot tighter, where there was much more of a everyone has to muck in approach. But still, with the green light given, the work on what would now be known as the Iron Giant could begin in earnest in January 1997. It was set to be a frantic, difficult production. And even with the storyboarding underway, even with Bird knowing the film that he wanted, really, there were going to be a lot of external pressures on this particular project. Now, they made some decisions here. It was going to be a hand-drawn film, and this was at a point where, Toy Story had come out, a year and a half before the green lit was given to the Iron Giant. And so it was still hand-drawn. That was still in vogue. There was still, DreamWorks was making hand-drawn films. Disney was. Warner Brothers had a Camelot movie going through as well. But they realised that they needed something more to create the actual giant himself. And that's where computer work was having to come in. They were going to use a bit of CG. Now, CG and animation have been blending for a while. You go back to Disney's Basil the Great Mouse Detective for that. You look at the ballroom sequence in Beauty and the Beast, the nascent work of Pixar on the big screen there. But they'd worked out early in the process that hand-drawn alone wasn't going to be enough. That had come through with storyboards. They knew that they were going to they were looking for a visual style influenced by artists such as Norman Rockwell. And at the heart of this, Bird was a first-time director who wasn't afraid to ask for help. And again, his television deadline helped there. That whole camaraderie of a television animation team where if you didn't know what to do, you just talk to someone, as opposed to the slightly more silo-driven animation style done with on big traditional studio animated movies. It also affected the way that Abate and Bird split the film up, because he would structure things a little bit differently there. Disney animated movies would generally see animators given individual characters to supervise. But what they did was they kept the style of the characters in The Iron Giant constant and a bit more centralised here, and instead animators were given part of the script to make. Now, this is akin to somewhere like Aardman, that Aardman, a specific animator, is given a list of scenes to do, and the studio floor at Aardman is generally split into 20, 30, 40 working sets at any one time. Animators on this particular project were taken away to the area of Maine in the US for a week, because that was going to be the geographic area where Bird wanted to set the film. And what he found as this developed is the mix of CG and hand-drawn gave him a contrast that he was looking for. That there was the contrast of the alien giant against the human side of the story, but they still had to build imperfections into the CG modelling to make sure it wasn't all straight lines and clean and uniform. This brought to mind the Michael Bay's film Pearl Harbor. It's not the most obvious parallel, but there was a point where they were doing sequences in the special effects of Pearl Harbor where they had to build in the imperfections of a missile dropping because otherwise an audience wouldn't believe it. And they felt the same to a degree here, that the imperfections were crucial just to marry the film up. Now, there were obvious touch points to the giant himself. The day the Earth stood still, a lot of classic sci-fi in there. It was Joe Johnston who came in to do design work on the giant. Johnston, a special effects winner on the Oscar winner on the Star Wars films, but also director of films like Jumanji and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the first Captain America film, the first Marvel Captain America film, to be clear. A voice cast was coming together as well. This was an era where big stars were starting to voice animated films. If you go to the poster for Toy Story, it's Tom Hanks and Tim Allen's name is on the poster. DreamWorks in the ensuing years would put names above the title, on animated films. And there was a feeling that if you get a movie star on board, Robin Williams in Aladdin was the turning point here, that's an extra box office draw. But Bird wanted little shrift with that he was very, very careful in his casting. He didn't want to go gimmicky. So, for instance, the giant himself speaks just over 50 words in total in the film, and his voice was going to be computer manipulated, particularly in the early stages of the movie. And those words would be spoken by an upcoming actor called Vin Diesel. What on earth happened to him? Also brought in were the likes of Jennifer Aniston and Harry Connick Jr. They were part of the ensemble. And Bird leaned on people that he knew as well. Christopher McDonald is a good example there, to flesh out the voice cast of his movie. The animation team itself was a mix of veterans and upcoming animators and artists. There were also students brought in from California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, who were doing some work experience stuff, but a couple of those joined the crew as well. And there was a lot of people on what was primarily a young crew who had never tackled a project like this, not least its director. And that schedule was tight. And as Bird would describe it, the crew ran the gamut from animation veterans like Tony Facile and Steve Markowski to wet behind the ears CalArts students, getting their first chance to work on production, and every level in between. Now, in the midst of production, a copy of the script was sent to Ted Hughes. Now, Hughes would pass away the year before the film came out, but he looked at the screenplay and was a huge fan of it and what Bird had done and how he had changed the story. But still, even while the film was progressing, and in spite of Hughes being happy with it, there were problems at Warner Brothers itself, and there were broader problems with the animation industry too, because a transformation again was taking place. Pixar had changed what studios were wanting. That Toy Story had done mega money. All of a sudden, every studio wanted a computer animated film, and hand-drawn movies, well, there was a feeling they were starting to struggle heavily at the box office. This wouldn't necessarily prove to be true in 99, as I'll come to, but take, for instance, Warner Brothers' animated hope Quest for Camelot that came out in 1998. And this was a rude awakening for the studio. That film had overrun. It split its animation between London and Los Angeles. It cost $40 million to make, and it didn't recoup that at the box office. And meanwhile, there were CG films, which were the new shiny thing, and so Warner Brothers executives were looking more in that direction, and the studio management decided to pivot, even while The Iron Giant was in production. It was going to move away from feature animated movies, that the costs of Camelot had spiraled, left a lot of red ink on the studio's books, and had changed its outlook. And so even though the crew was shared actually across Quest for Camelot, quite a lot of that crew came to work on The Iron Giant as well. The impact on The Iron Giant was its budget was cut further. The schedule was cut as well at this point. But the trade-off at that stage, as Brad Bird would recognise in subsequent interviews, was they got more autonomy. That Quest for Camelot had a lot of studio fingerprints on it, was very much on the studio radar, but now that animation was going out of vogue, feature animation at least at Warner Brothers, well, they were left a lot more to their own devices. Now, it took a lot of planning because one thing Bird recognised straight away was he couldn't go 1 cent over the budget here. So everything had to be planned. They couldn't put sequences into animation that would be wasted because Warner Brothers, I mean, there was significant doubt at the point about would Warner Brothers actually continue with the movie? Would they just cut their losses and shut it down? And it's not to say the studio didn't have notes at various points throughout the production. It wanted to kiddify it a little bit, wanted to change the setting, adding a comedy animal psychic character. But they managed to get this through the system and over the line at a point where the animation department around them was shutting down. The film got to a point where it was pretty much completed and in a viewable state. And they did keep checking the film and rescreening it as it was gradually being built more and more. But by the start of 1999, there was a feeling it was in a pretty good state. The problem was that feeling wasn't recognised within Warner Brothers itself. And here is possibly that, I mean, Brian Raftersby talks about this in his book, Best Movie Year Ever. I'm going to quote him just in a minute about Warner Brothers just did not know what it had with The Iron Giant. That became very, very, very clear. So right throughout production, Bird and his production team, we're after something fairly simple here. We want a release date. We want to know when the film is coming out. But Warner Brothers was reluctant to do that. As a result, without a release date, it couldn't plan a proper marketing campaign. And with the best will in the world, a proper marketing campaign for a major release from a studio can take 6-12 months to put together. As they went into the start of 1999, they still had no release date. There was a feeling that Warner Brothers didn't have a fat lot of confidence in the film. And I mean, in early 1999, this sort of came to a head. That Brian Raftersby tells the story in his book about in early 99, Bird was in a room with executives from his studio. I'm quoting the book here. And he said he showed them some rough footage and artwork from The Iron Giant. He said it was very exciting. And then one guy said, I don't know how to sell this movie. Now, this completely took Bird back. And he said a brief pause followed as Bird absorbed what he heard. And he said, I've been polite for too many years. And he said, if I told you I didn't know how to direct this movie, I'd be clucking fired. He said, are you telling me you can't figure out how to sell a giant robot and a kid? That's popcorn one-on-one. And as Bird acknowledges in the interview in the book, he said, by then I'd grown a pair of balls. Now, what changed the narrative here were screenings of the movie, but also a leaked version of the film. that a version of the film was leaked to a reporter called Drew McWeeny, who was then writing for Ain't It Cool News. And apparently one of the animators had just put a version of this, incomplete really, and with a lot of sequences left to be finished. But McWeeny, to his credit, put a piece out on the website just saying this film is terrific, and Warner Brothers has no idea what it's got. And that narrative was picked up by other outlets as well. I think the Los Angeles Times picked it up. Then all of a sudden there's this word of mouth that Warner Brothers had this hugely special animated movie that it had no idea how to sell. They were having test screenings where results were going through the roof. And eventually the studio realised it might have something really quite sparkling here. But it was all a little bit too late. Now, it finally gave them a release date. It got to April 1999 before the movie was given a release date, and that was August the 6th, 1999 in the US. Now that, I mean, by my maths, is a roughly 4 months to turn a marketing campaign around. It still wasn't too late to do a Burger King tie-in. Burger King had seen the film and liked the idea of it and wanted to do something. I mean, what was the other big family movie? Tarzan was around. Inspector Gadget was going to be around. But it liked the film. But Warner Brothers didn't move fast enough. And I mean, by the time it realised that it could have done something, there were just no tie-ins for the movie. The marketing campaign was really, really, really tame. And as Brad Bird would reflect to the website Joe Blow, he said they weren't prepared for it to be good. And to be fair to them, they actually knew they'd screwed up when the film turned out the way it did and it scored so highly. And they suggested to him at that point, we should delay it and properly lead up to his release. And Brad Bird said to them, you guys have had 2.5 years to get ready for this. And he was feeling confident. He was emboldened by the fact that the test screening scores were through the roof, that there was now a bit of a build-up of media momentum behind the movie. And he felt that they should stick to their release date, which is ultimately what they did. Now, he would also, I should note, when it came to putting the score together, I asked Brad Bird about this once, sit next to the late, great composer Michael Kamen. And he discusses this on the Iron Giant DVD extras as well, as he scored the movie and got involved in the positioning of beats and such forth. And Kamen was such a core collaborator for him on this one. And the film came together. The film was finished. The film was ready to go in front of audiences and critics. And what do you know? All those rumours were entirely correct. The critical response to The Iron Giant was absolutely ecstatic. It was getting rave reviews, even from places that didn't tend to rave about family animated movies. And the word was spreading. The word was out. The Iron Giant was really, really, really special, and it deserved to be seen. So, heading into that opening weekend, well, the problem was people weren't seeing it. As Bird would tell the Los Angeles Times, he said, our exit poll results have been outstanding. Once we get into the people into the theatre for the first minute, they love it. But the challenge has been getting them into the theatre at all. A lot of people simply aren't aware that the film is even out there. And this was under the title of an article published in the Los Angeles Times called It's Here, Why Aren't You Watching?, which was published the week after The Iron Giant came out. And I mean, there's no way of putting a positive spin on this. The Iron Giant's box office returns for a film that cost somewhere between 50 to 70 million in the end, depending which source you go with, were poor. That they were looking for at least an $8 million opening weekend. And it opened, I mean, that was low, but it opened in ninth place with a $5.7 million opening weekend on over 2,000 screens, with a poor marketing campaign, no tie-ins at all. And meanwhile, films around it were cleaning up. I mean, the narrative that people weren't seeing hand-drawn animation movies that year, nonsense. Tarzan was up to $161 million and still in the top 15 at that point, 2 months after release. But then Disney had been building to the release of Tarzan for a year. All of the tie-ins, all of the advertising were there. Tarzan, in fact, I was in New York that summer and Tarzan was everywhere. The film that it opened against, I mean, there was some big openers that week, to be fair. The Sixth Sense opened in first place with 26 million. The Blair Witch Project was still around. Runaway Bride. Thomas Crown Affair opened in 4th place with 14 million. Mystery Men. I mean, these are all films I'm coming to again in the future. Opened with 10 million in 6th place. If you go down the chart as well, another undiscovered gem really in 12th place was the film Dick from Andrew Fleming. That's really worth seeking out. $2 million. The Iron Giant was struggling and it would never recoup it. It would never build that momentum was required at the box office. And by the time it left cinemas, it had done, 20 odd million in the US for a film, for one of the best reviewed films of the year. It would only add another 10 million outside of the US. And very, very quickly, the reporting was Warner Brothers had absolutely fumbled this. And going to that Los Angeles Times article, it talks about there's no making of or art of book, as there was even for as film, their quote, as forgettable a film as Anastasia. Their bookstores are filled with juvenile titles tied to Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace and Tarzan, but interested readers will look in vain for Iron Giant books. There's not even a special edition of Ted Hughes' original story. Burger King had wanted a tie-in when they saw the movie, but Warner Brothers was sluggish. It was a box office flop. And the reason it was a box office flop was put firmly down to the numbers. And as Birdwood explained to Brian Raftery's book again, he said, I was crushed by the numbers. To have it declared dead that quickly is disastrous. But he did get a phone call off a man called Guillermo del Toro. You heard of him? And at that point, he was known for the film Kronos more than anything else. And Bird recalls, he said, he basically talked me off the ledge and told me that the film would stick around. Well, prescient words, because that's exactly what happened. The film did stick around. And the reputation of the film was growing. And this wasn't a case of it was growing over years. It was growing over a case of weeks and months, to the point where Warner Brothers tried again with the DVD release at the end of that year to give it another push and put a bit more marketing heft behind it. It didn't really work, but, to a degree, the ship had sailed there. But still, the DVD release of it got it more and more fans. And for Brad Bird, I mean, he will jump, because Warner Brothers weren't making hand-drawn animated movies after that. He would jump to Pixar, where the film was absolutely adored, and go on to do The Incredibles and Ratatouille at Pixar. And it got to the point where the reputation was continuing to soar, and there was pressure on Warner Brothers to put together a proper Blu-ray of the movie. Now, I talked to Bird about this when he was promoting Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol in 2014. And he said at that point, I've been talking with Warner Brothers for basically the past 10 years, and all sorts of options have been discussed. But Warner Brothers, even then, wanted to put out a plain Blu-ray of the film, but Brad Bird wasn't having any of it. He said there's been talk of doing about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes of new animation for it. He explained that there were sequences that we designed in the middle that I think were cool. He says there'd been talk of doing it in 3D. There's been talk of doing a limited digital release, kind of like Blade Runner had at the time. And all of them blossom and fade. And he said, now we're having more serious discussions about doing something in anticipation of the Blu-ray. But he was adamant at that stage, I don't want the Blu-ray to simply be a higher resolution version of our DVD. He wanted to get into how the film had come to be, now that they all have perspective, and the making of it. And he got his wish, that the Blu-ray would indeed come to life. And it was an absolute delight that there was a signature edition of the movie that was put back into cinemas in 2015. Now, this added the sequences that had been cut before, that they were reanimated and put into the movie. And that cinema release, in fact, the cinema release in the UK was confined to kids' club screenings. I remember this at the time because I know a load of people who weren't kids who tried to go along but were turned away because they didn't have children with them. But there you go. I had kids. I got in to see it, and I saw the film on the big screen with all. And what a delight of a movie it was and remains. And finally, in the aftermath of the release of the signature edition, and the Blu-ray is really terrific, we did finally get an Art of the Iron Giant book. We did finally get things like, the Iron Giant turned up in Steven Spielberg's Ready Player One, which goes to just what a touch point has become more and more over time. There's still a feeling that this is a beautifully cinematic film. Bird even framed it in a very cinematic ratio. It's 2:39 to 1 off the top of my head. that hasn't fully had its due. I mean, to my mind, it's a masterpiece. It's Brad Bird's masterpiece, and he's gone on to make some terrific film scenes. But it's an absolutely gorgeous, wonderful film that's never fully, I would argue, recovered from a very, very stumbly and mishandled release. The fact that it existed at all against the backdrop of what the animation department of Warner Brothers was going through at that point is a minor miracle. The fact that it's come out as well as it has is really quite something. All I would say on this is if you've not had the pleasure of The Iron Giant, what a treat you are in for. I can't put it any clearer than that. If you have had the pleasure, well, do what I did, go watch it again. It's a film that never lets you down. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices before we get on to the next film I'm going to talk about. So if you like this podcast and you're keen to support it, I mean, bless you, I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew. You will get the podcast early if you sign up there and support us there. You also find out gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes too. Quite a few things coming up that I can't talk about yet, but I will as soon as I can. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously as well. If you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps. These are all the things that help independent podcasts without massive or any marketing budget. And I thank everyone who's supported me and had my back on this so far. The latest issue of Film Stories magazine is also shipping. It's got the brilliant Adil Akhtar on the front cover talking about a couple of his films, Ali and Ava and Save the Cinema, both of which I hugely recommend. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to go to a second film where the marketing was said to have been quite mishandled on it. I'm going to play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
1 year ago, an elite commando unit was sent to prison for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security facility. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers for hire.
This is beyond nuts, boss.
It gets better.
Now we're talking.
You miss me? 'Cause I miss you.
If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them...
Sucks to be you, homie.
You look like you got a real bad attitude.
Maybe you can hire
I love it when a plan comes together.
the A-Team.
What the hell is that? If you look out on the right-hand side of the aircraft, you'll notice.
So that was a clip. You probably guessed that from the end of that. From The A-Team, the movie version of The A-Team, directed by Joe Carnahan. Screenplay credited to Carnahan, Brian Bloom and Skip Woods. Based on the TV show, The A-Team. And starring Liam Neeson, Bradley Cooper, Jessica Biel, Quinton Rampage Jackson, Sharlto Copley and Patrick Wilson. Now, The A-Team, if you're around in the 1980s, you need no introduction to it, was huge. Absolutely gigantic. Big action TV series that was getting tens of millions of viewers, was a global hit. And created by Stephen J. Cannell, and for a long time this was mooted for the movies. In earnest, it was in the 90s really, it started to bubble up in earnest, that it went through 2 movie studios in that era. I can't even get to the bottom of exactly which ones in truth, but there had been talk for an awful long time about making a film of it, and the project eventually landed at 20th Century Fox in the very late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, the story of the A-Team movie is one that gets embroiled in a few little arguments and disputes, one in particular about its writers. So, for some reason, this was a film around the time of its release that ended up in the crosshairs of a movie reporter, gossip columnist Nikki Fink, who founded the website Deadline. Now, Deadline had come to prominence during the Writers Guild of America strike towards the end of the 2000s, and she was feared for assorted reasons that I don't fully understand, that she was the town's most read gossip columnist at this point, and she decided to take a swing at the 80s. I was never a huge fan of hers, to be clear, but she's kind of important to this bit of the story, because she ran a report just around the point of the movie's release that lifted the bonnet on just how exhausted the writing process had been on the film. That she singled out a man called Alex Young, the co-president at the time of 20th Century Fox Production, who left his post fairly quickly after the release. And he was a man who was reported at the Los Angeles Times, actually, as having hired quite a football team's worth of writers for the A-Team movie. Because this was one that was going to take a decade to get through 20th Century Fox development process. Now, just to set the scene a little bit, for Fox at this point, it was not uncommon to bring in lots of writers on an assortment of projects just to try and crack a film. Now, what the Deadline report did was she named all of the writers who would become involved over the course of the A-Team's development with the studio. She named them as 5 single writers and 3 teams of 2 writers, with names such as Kevin Broadbent, Bruce Furstein, Jason Rothwell, Lawrence M. Connor and Mark Rosenthal, Michael Brandt and Derek Haas, Skip Woods, Joe Carnahan, Brian Bloom and Matthew Carnahan. Now, Young at Fox had been said to have taken over the production of the film in 2002, shortly after the studio had acquired the rights to make the movie of the TV show. And there were reports very early on that even though they'd acquired the name to the A-Team, they weren't actually going to lean towards the television programme at all. That the influence on the project at that stage was more kind of something a bit more Jason Bourne-y, that pulled a lot of the humour out. That was a bit more slick and a bit more actiony and, well, not very true to what the A-Team was. And the assorted writers who worked on the project over time were coming from a core idea that, I mean, the A-Team originally were a team of mercenaries who came together in Vietnam, but here that was going to shift to Iraq, and then it was going to have built from there. Now, I should point out that the eventual director of the A-Team movie, Joe Carnahan, did not hold back at the time with his criticism of Nicky Fink, and I will give him voice, and I will come back to that shortly. But in the midst of the development process, Fox also knew that Stephen J. Cannell, who'd created the show, had got script approval on it. Even as writers came and went, it was taking time to get to the point of showing him the script. The writers' strike came in as well, and there were all sorts of delays, and Cannell was just not being shown material, really, because there was nothing that they were happy with to show him. And it was said to be Skip Woods, who was the person who finally cracked the idea for the story for the movie and got it, not got it over the line, but certainly gave it the leap forward that it needed. Now, the closest it came in between that period of 2000 and 2008 to actually going forward was when John Singleton was hired to direct the film, and news of this landed in December 2007. Now, Singleton, the youngest nominee for Best Director at the Academy Awards for the wonderful Boys in the Hood. We lost him a few years ago, and what a loss he is. Had gone on to do commercial films as well, like Shaft and Too Fast, Too Furious, along with movies like Poetic Justice. And at this stage, he was said to be keen to get the movie pressing ahead. There was an incentive to get it pressing ahead, to get the film moving before the writer's strike really hit. And he was open about the fact there were no plans to use the TV cast for the film at this stage. I mean, George Peppard, who played Hannibal in the TV programme, had passed away a few years ago before. Mr. T, who played B.O. Baracus, had been open about the fact he was reluctant to cameo. I'm not going to do the voice or an impression, but he was quoted as saying, "We don't do cameos, you don't respect us, or pow pow." He said, "It's insulting me to ask me to be in it as someone else. It's just like my ex-girlfriend saying, 'Why don't you come out to dinner with my new boyfriend?'" As he explained, "You see what I mean? I'm not going to do that." Spoiler, he didn't do that. Singleton, though, was wanting the film at that stage to be an 80s-style action movie. He gave an interview to Collider at this point as he was looking to press ahead with the film, and he was using films like Lethal Weapon as a touchpoint, action-driven with bits of humour, and it was starting to sound a little bit more like the A-Team at that point. Ice Cube was in the running at this point to take on the role of B.A. Baracus, and Singleton also said he was looking for Woody Harrelson to play Howling Mad Murdoch, And the plan at that stage was to sign up a cast for multiple films. There were sequels built into this. And Singleton had been working with Michael Brandt and Derek Haas on a script. They'd done 3:10 to Yuma. They'd worked with him on Too Fast, Too Furious. They'd done a rewrite he was happy with. And as far as he was concerned, he was talking in January 2008 about he was being ready to go within months, that they could start filming it in the first half of that year. Again, spoiler, they did not start filming it in the first half of that year. There were names being bandied around, such as The Rock, Jim Carrey, Mel Gibson. They were going heavy star-driven movie at that stage. But by October 2008, Singleton was out, and the reason was apparently Alvin and the Chipmunks. That Variety reported that he'd cancelled his contract when 20th Century Fox wanted to put the A-Team movie back to 2010, so instead it could put its resources towards a sequel to the Alvin and the Chipmunks movie, and that's actually what it did. Singleton wasn't best pleased at this point, and at this stage the press rumours were George Clooney was interested in playing Hannibal, Bruce Willis had been linked, Ice Cube and Tyrese were interested in BA, but nobody had been cast. And with Fox preferring Alvin and the Chipmunks 2, I presume it was at that point, Singleton was off the project. Now, by this stage, the development had just been exhaustive, and Stephen J. Cannell would give an interview to Entertainment Weekly saying the studio kept giving us screenwriters who'd never seen the show. He said the first screenwriter we had was an Irish guy who kept giving Hannibal lines like, "Whilst you are going here," he said he had no ear for American idiom whatsoever. Now, bubbling up while the A-Team was going through its development hell was filmmaker Joe Carnahan. Now, he had come close to making a huge studio movie before, off the back of the success of his brilliant breakthrough film, Narc, a film that interested Tom Cruise to the point where he was willing to lend his name to what I think executive producer on Narc. And he went from doing Narc to signing up to direct Mission Impossible 3 with Tom Cruise. Now, he would work on Mission Impossible 3 for 15 months before eventually walking away from it, primarily because he and Cruise, in his words, weren't seeing the same movie. He said, as he told Entertainment Weekly, Carnahan was really looking to make something darker and geopolitical. And so he moved away from that and went off to make the film Smoking Aces instead, a film that's still popular to the point where it's now getting a 4K disc release as I talk in March 2022. That's just been announced. But one thing Joe Carnahan wasn't was a fan of the A-Team. He hadn't grown up as a huge fan of the show, but he was a director very much in demand. He'd had 2 movies that had really broken through. He'd been close to making Mission Impossible 3. Studios were keen to work with him. And also, Tony and Ridley Scott were in Carnahan's sphere. Now, the Scott brothers had their production deal with Scott Free, their company over at 20th Century Fox, and it was they who introduced Carnahan to Fox, and things started to come together. That Fox finally had a direction it wanted to go with the film, and it had an in-demand director who would do it. And so the new creative team was announced on January the 27th, 2009, and this would be the team that would take it to release. That the Scott brothers were going to be involved as producers on the movie. It was Tony Scott who took the credit in the end. That Joe Carnahan was going to direct. They were going to do a bit of rewrite work on the script, and Carnahan and Brian Bloom, along with Skip Woods, would be finally credited for it. Carnahan at that stage had been looking to make a movie called Killing Pablo that he put on hold. But the idea at this point was a June 2009 shoot ahead of a June the 11th, 2010 release. And this would pretty much hold. In fact, this would hold that the film was going to press ahead and they could finally get to actually doing a bit of casting. So, by April 2009, Chris Pine was lobbying to play the role of Murdoch in the movie, for instance. But by June of 2009, well, the plan was coming together. Bradley Cooper was in talks to take on the role of Face, negotiating while he was on the press tour for the first Hangover movie. Liam Neeson had become an action star off the back of Taken, and now he seemed ideal for the role of Hannibal, and his price was going up, but negotiations soon got underway there. Carnahan and Brian Bloom did their script polish around this point. They took the tone, they made the tone a little less campy, more in keeping with a modern Mission Impossible or Oceans film. Those were the touch points they were going for. Other names who were in the running for the role of Murdoch were Rob Corddry and Sean William Scott. I mean, William Scott off the back of the American Pie films. But having broken through off the back of District 9, it was 18 fanatic Sholto Copley who got the role there. Now, the studio was said, according to Entertainment Weekly, to have strong ideas about who should get the BA role, and they were pushing Joe Carnahan to hire a famous rap artist whose name Carnahan wasn't revealing at the point. And as the director described, the audition was a disaster. He said, literally one of the worst performances ever committed to tape. Instead, in came Quinton Rampage Jackson for a reading, and Carnahan just said, that's Abaracus. He just got it. September 2009, Copley was confirmed. Jessica Biel was cast as well. Patrick Wilson signed on the dotted line that month as well. And finally, the filming of the A-Team could get underway. It would be shot in Canada, even though there was lots of desert footage and even though there were bits in Iraq, it was all done on location in and around the Vancouver area. They did use bits of stock footage as well. You see that fairly early in the movie. Carnahan gives an interesting DVD commentary on this one that I went through. He points out lots of little bits and bobs like that. He also, in particular, points out, I mean, whilst he's open about bits where they use CG in the film, about how much he wanted this to be stunt-driven, that he had lots of friends in the stunt community, and he wanted to do as much of the action, as much of the fights properly, and you see that in the movie as well. And, I mean, there were lots of nods to the original A-Team TV show in there. He put in nods to The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, to Raiders of the Lost Ark as well. There was some ingenuity in the use of locations in and around Vancouver as well. I mean, they had to go 2.5 hours out to find a place that could work as a desert. At one point, they shot in a sandpit where a Walmart was being built. They were using big sets. They were doing this huge physically. And Carnahan also, as well as getting his action sequences in the can, he knew he had a cast that could riff and could improvise. And so he was happy to keep the camera running and let people ad-lib. People like Bradley Cooper in particular had a lot of fun with that. Cooper, for one, was also thrown into a stunt where he found himself under a truck going at 35 miles per hour at one point. And, I mean, it was a fairly quick shoot, really, for a big action movie. Dwight Schultz, one of the original A-Team, confirmed at the end of 2009, by the way, he filmed a cameo in it. But the shoot in the end went from 14th of September 2009 to the 18th of September 2009 and it soon headed into post-production. Now, at this stage, we're going to come to another marketing problem because 20th Century Fox struggled to sell this one again, really, that it would position the movie almost exclusively at a male audience. And that wasn't necessarily the audience who turned up to see the film. So Carnahan was giving, press shots were coming out of the new A-Team. And there was lots of press interest in the movie. And Carnahan was giving interviews. He was very open about it. He would talk to Collider about we're not making a homage to the A-Team. He said we're taking the base story of 4 guys wrongly convicted of a crime. They're an alpha unit. That's the point of departure. There were a lot of scenes too that were cut out in the edit involving Dirk Benedict and Dwight Schultz from the original A-Team as well. Those would be reinstated, come an extended version that was subsequently released on DVD. But the film was moving together, it was on time, and also it was heading for that release date. The price of it had gone up. It was originally going to cost somewhere around $80 million. By the time tax credits were factored in, it would cost Fox about $100 million to make. Tie-in comics were organised. There was a heavy marketing campaign put together. I think there was an app for it as well at that point. But it wasn't really getting the level of tracking that they needed. And, I mean, it didn't help that, for instance, Mr. T was given a preview screening of the movie. And, this made headlines. He told Yahoo that people die in the film and there's plenty of sex. But when we did it, no one got hurt and it was all played for fun and family entertainment. And so Mr. T was not a fan. He said, these seem to be elements nobody's interested in anymore. It was too graphic for me. I've no doubt it will do big business at the box office, but it's nothing like the show we turned out every week. And over time, in fact, Dirk Benedict would also backtrack his involvement in the film and suggest that he wasn't keen. But around the time of the film's release, that's when the stories were stirring about the number of writers on it and the arbitration that had led to the 3 people being credited who were. The narrative was just wrong, really. that it wasn't building up to a huge, big, exciting action film. And Carnahan would acknowledge this in an interview he gave to the Wall Street Journal after the film's release. He said, "We kind of fell victim to a marketing misstep in that there wasn't necessarily an understanding of what the show was." He said, "We didn't do an adequate enough job of telling people what the movie was, if you know what I mean." And Carnahan's very open in his interviews, and the predictions that the movie was not going to be the huge success Fox wanted, well, they came true when it was released, and it hit that release date. It didn't help it was in the middle of a football World Cup. It didn't help too that the critical response wasn't great. I mean, it was okay, but then also reviews of action movies, well, it's questionable just how much impact they have, particularly around summer blockbusters. I mean, I remember Carnahan being bemused really by critics who suggested this wasn't realistic, and it's just like he's making an A-Team movie. But there was enough really to generate interest in an opening weekend, and the film opened with $25.6 million worth of business that weekend in the US of June the 11th to the 13th. But it was up against a surprise hit. That there was a bit of bad luck on its side here, in that the reboot of The Karate Kid was starring Jackie Chan and Jaden Smith, if memory serves. Well, that had hit bigger than expected. That it had opened to a $55 million opening weekend, the same weekend that the A-Team came out, shot to number one at the box office, and the A-Team was in second place with $25.6 million. Other films around in the top 10 at this point, and there were a few that had underperformed. The Prince of Persia movie was around, that hadn't done great guns. The Robin Hood movie was still just about in the, I think it was number 11, still around the chart at that point. And then films such as Shrek Forever After, Get Him to the Greek, Marmaduke, crikey, remember that? That was another Fox one that had come out the week before. Sex and the City 2, Iron Man 2 was cleaning up. But still, the A-Team hadn't quite had the impact that was expected. And in the subsequent weeks, it didn't build its audience either. That it gradually dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped to the point where the US gross for the A-Team movie was $77 million, and Fox would have been looking for 9 figures for that. It did have some overseas legs to it. It grossed $100 million outside of the US for a worldwide gross of $177 million. But with the cast signed up for sequels and plans for sequels, it didn't look in a hurry like they were going to happen. Now, Carnahan wasn't explicitly pointing blame or anything like this at this point, but he was open about various matters around the film's release that he wasn't happy with. He launched, I think it's fair to say, he launched a tirade against Nikki Fink as well, which she then turned into articles as well, turned into more clickbait. And I mean, the whole thing really took away from the conversation of the film. And it's important for me to note that he had his right to reply on that, and he did put his reply out there. In fact, he's just in a film called Cop Shop as well. Interesting movie, and there's a suggestion there that there's more of a story to come out. If I'm reading between the lines, Carnahan didn't quite get his final cut on that one. I'd certainly be interested to see what his version of that was. We did at least get to see his extended version of the A-Team when the DVD came around at the end of 2010, but it wasn't enough to turn the metaphorical tanker here. That the sales were okay, but the DVD boom had peaked a couple of years before. I think if the A-Team had been released in the mid-2000s, we would have got a sequel. And they wanted to make a sequel, and they talked about what the sequel would be. But as it turned out, it just didn't make enough money. It didn't get enough interest, and Fox walked away from doing more A-Team films at that point. There has been talk more recently about another reboot. I mean, there was talk about another TV show. There was talk about another movie, and who knows, that may yet happen. Carnahan instead would go on straight away to reunite with Liam Neeson for a really interesting film, which I will come to in a future podcast, called The Grey. Wolf Puncher, as it was described in the marketing. That was another one with really odd marketing that didn't necessarily marry up to the film. I would suggest it's one of Carnahan's best, though. As for the A-Team, I mean, it's worth having a look at, certainly. I don't think it's his best. I do think it's a film that got chewed up in a whole development cycle at a studio. It's sort of a miracle in the end that it came out. And in a coda of sorts for this podcast as well, it's interesting going back to Brad Bird's project, the project that he tried to get off the ground, Ray Gunn. That's now coming back to life at Skydance Animation. He's going over there to work with his old boss, John Lasseter. There's a story. say. And so that film is in the works. Who knows that Joe Carnahan may finally be able to turn his attention to the Killing Pablo story, which a film he was trying to make a long, long time ago. Who knows? That one might come back to life too. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We've got a shop, store.filmstories.co.uk, where we now have 39 issues of our assorted magazines and one Blu-ray for sale. If you go to filmstories.co.uk, that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mayhem and bits and bobs there. And I've got a live show coming up too in Birmingham in the West Midlands in the UK on the 30th of March 2022, my Movie Geek live show at the Midlands Arts Centre. You can find more details on that at the Film Stories website, filmstories.co.uk. For now, though, I'm going to leave you in peace. I've waffled too much, as always. The main thing is, you all look after yourselves. You all stay safe. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.